Welcome to Livestock Podcast, sponsored by the University of Tennessee Beef and Forage Center. I'm Bruno Pedreira, Center Director and Forage Extension Specialist, joined today by Dr. Katie Mason, our UT Extension Beef Cattle Specialist. How are you doing, Dr. Mason?
I'm great. Happy to be doing another podcast.
Yeah, that's time for another podcast again. And today we are here to welcome Dr. Forbes Walker, Professor and Environmental Soil Specialist with the Department of Biosystems Engineer and Soil Science. Welcome to our Livestock Podcast, Dr. Walker.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you here, man. Let's talk a little bit about Hurricane Helene, right? Katie, tell me about this.
So, hurricane hit our area last September, right? Last fall, in the eastern region of Tennessee mostly. Tell us a little bit about just your immediate assessment of what happened there.
Well, as we all know, by the time it hit Tennessee, it was a tropical storm, not a hurricane. But yes, it was a very large event in our part of the world. Not unprecedented, but very, very big event. So, as you know, the hurricane started over the Gulf, came up through Georgia, up through our part, and then just kind of sat for a bit. And we had some extremely high rainfall events here in Tennessee, up to about 15 inches of rain. However, in North Carolina, in the mountains, they had about double that amount, and that's really what caused the big flooding problems. It's not so much the high rainfall events in Tennessee, but it's the terrain in North Carolina. 30 inches of rain was reported in some parts that then came down and flooded us out.
Yeah. And although still is talking about this assessment just after the hurricane, what are the numbers? I know you have all of them in your head in terms of, how much land was really affected with this.
So we obviously, different watersheds that were impacted in different ways. We've been doing a lot of work in the Nolichucky watershed, which is a watershed that starts up in the mountains of North Carolina, goes for 118 miles and dumps into Douglas Lake. So Unicoi County, Washington County, Greene County, parts of Hamlin and little bits of Cott County, I believe. But in terms of, is this an unusual event? If you look at the records show in the Nolichucky, in the last 200 years, we've had 5 or 6 major events like that, going back to the early 1800s.
Flood events.
Major flood events. The big thing about this flood event is it was off the charts in comparison of what we've had in the past events. So the last big one in our area was in 1977. Prior to that, it was 1916, 1901, 1867, 1824 were the big events. But we have seen examples of, graves where people that were buried in the early 1800s, where the sediment is covering half of their headstones, which tells us that this is a really, really big event in those parts there. The other thing to note is, yes, this is not unusual. These extreme weather events have been happening in the past. We only need to remember a few years back in Waverly, in Humphreys County, Tennessee, that event there. Go back a few years, there was a major event in the Nashville area that almost topped the dams in Nashville. So, yeah, these events happen. They're going to carry on happening. And so we've got to be ready for the next one.
Yeah. And you have been visiting, the whole UT team here has been visiting a lot of farmers in the area. What kind of feedback and observations you have heard from producers since then?
So the producers in the area, whether it's in the Nolichucky or in the French Broad or the Pigeon River or wherever, some places, for example, if you go to Carter County, the big issue there was rocks being deposited on fields, rocks and sand, but small sandbars. You go to other places where it just flooded and there was nothing really deposited, and it went on. In the Nolichucky, depending on how that water came onto the field, how long it stayed, you had some very significant deposits. We know of some farms where 200 acres with 6 feet of sand on the things. If the water stayed longer, we get silt deposits, and we've seen deposits of silt up to 4 feet, which is again really, really, unusual for what we've had. So yeah, this is so the impacts. Obviously, those folks that are buried under with 6 feet of sand, there's not a. It's very expensive to remove that sand,
Yes.
and if you could remove it, where would you put it? If you think
And we are not talking about 2 or 3 acres, right?
we're talking hundreds of acres in some places of the river. So if you think, 8 inches of sand over an acre, that's about 1,000 tons. So it's a very expensive undertaking to remove that. The other thing is, if you were to remove it, you go back down to the old floodplain. The floodplain has reset itself, so you're going to be flooded again the next time it floods. So some of the things that we're thinking of and are doing some research on is how do we actually renovate these sands and these silts and get things growing back as to the desired forage species.
Yeah, so it's going to be a long-term project, right? Trying to evaluate everything that's happened and how do we move forward. So along some of those riverbanks, those areas were completely scalped of vegetation. How do you recommend farmers work with those severely affected zones to try to fix that?
So our first steps have been very much trying to understand the chemistry of what do we have in these sediments? What's the good, the bad, and the ugly in there? So some of our first steps, back in October, shortly after, a few weeks after the event, we would go and we collected a lot of sediment samples. We sent them off to our lab in Nashville to see what nutrients do we have in there? What pH do we have in there? Do we have any organic matter in there? And I will say the results of those initial assessments were surprising to me as a soils person.
Surprisingly good. Yeah.
Surprisingly good. So the pH surprisingly was around pH 6.5, which is kind of an ideal pH. I thought we wouldn't have any organic matter in these sands or these silts, but we had got some decent quantities of organic matter. That's really important because if we're trying to get these soils back working again, we've got to get that biology going, and the organic matter is what's going to drive the soil biology. In terms of the nutrients, we got reasonable quantities of phosphorus and potassium. We do have some micronutrient deficiencies. Things like boron are kind of deficient in some of our areas. One thing which is unusual for us, we're starting to see deficiencies in manganese. Manganese, typically, we don't have manganese deficiencies in Tennessee, but because we've now got these sandy soils and we've got manganese deficiency, it may not be as important for forage systems, but those folks in the vegetable systems, that may be a limiting factor.
Let's talk a little bit about vegetables, because as you mentioned that, we know that we have concerns now about herbicide residues or microplastics or other contaminants. How can growers determine whether if it's safe to be back in those fields or not?
So shortly after the event, there was a lot of concerns about how safe is it, and our recommendation, let's get your animals off those fields for at least 30 days. There was obviously some concerns about E. coli from failing septic systems and things. So let's get the animals off. If we can, get them onto a field that wasn't affected, let it be. The E. coli is going to take care of itself in time, and so that's no longer an issue. Other concerns were, we had a lot of fuel tanks that were floating around in the river, and we don't know, that fuel tank there, what's in that fuel tank? That diesel, did it leak onto the field? In which case the soil is probably going to take, over time, will take care of it. One of the other things that we had were legacy pesticides, things that were in the barns along the thing
for decades.
We didn't know what pesticides to look for. There could be, from the DDT era, DDT derivatives, but those are really expensive to identify and to test for. So typically it's $1,000 per sample to analyze for it. So we really haven't been
to analyze each of the herbicides. Right? I think that's a message that we need to send.
So one concern that we did have with some of our greenhouse studies, and in the greenhouse in Greenville, we looked at the major forage crops, the major vegetable crops, the major row crops that we were growing, to see, what plants are going to germinate. And then once they have germinated and established, what kind of symptoms do we have? And there was lots of, in our broadleaf species, there was a lot of things that looked like micronutrient deficiencies, which we kind of expected. There were some things that looked like herbicide damage. And we've actually gone and tested these sediments for herbicides. Unfortunately, the level at which the lab can detect the pesticide is above where we see the symptoms. So we've not been able to verify that these in fact are herbicide damage. And one of the major herbicides we think are some of the broadleaf herbicides that the beef cattle guys use to control broadleafs in their pastures.
Maybe on the vegetable fields.
And maybe going into the vegetable field.
Yeah.
So speaking of those pastures and hayfields, there was a lot of area there that, livestock were grazing, and people think about renovating or planting in the fall. Are you at a point now where you have a recommendation for this fall for folks?
So obviously the storm happened when we should have been planting if we were to do some fall seeding. And the issue was, we couldn't get onto many of those affected fields. They were very wet, especially the silt dominated sediments. The silts, they tend to dry out from the top. They crust over and they're still wet at the bottom, so you can't actually get equipment onto those fields. Some people were able to work some of the sands, but sands are kind of difficult to to stabilize. And so by the time people were ready to plant, it was the springtime, which is not really the ideal window. So we're basically gearing towards planting this coming fall with the desired, forage crops, the tall fescue and the orchard grass and things like that.
Yeah. What we saw in the greenhouse, Katie, was that when we tried to plant fescue and orchard grass by itself, it didn't work well. So that's part of the things we are planning to test during this fall, is to try to have a companion seed. So we may need oats or wheat to be planted with those perennial cool season forages that we have around here to help make through the crust.
Yeah.
I think we need to talk a little bit about the crust. When we brought this soil to the greenhouse.
And really what it was the larger seeds had the energy to germinate and actually punch their way through that crust that formed on the surface.
Yeah. We saw some of the fescue going under the crust and not be able to
the fescue,
make
it's a smaller seed, it couldn't punch its way through. So if we do mixed seeding with things like oats or wheat, the oats and the wheat are punching their way through the crust, and then the fescue can follow behind. That's our thinking at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we will learn a lot with this as we go through. Tennessee has been helping us, and farmers in Tennessee have been helping us to understand what is the best situation. And we have been doing as we learn and as things happen in Tennessee. But let's wrap up this conversation, Forbes, talking about our field day. We're going to have a flood recovery field day next week at one of the farmers we have been working with.
So at this field day, which is in Washington County, we're going to be talking about some of the things that we've been doing. This farm was one of the most severely impacted farms in the area. 3.5 miles of riverbanks. So we mentioned already the riverbanks are fairly unstable, especially after a lot of the woody debris was removed. So we'll be talking about what we can do to stabilize those banks. Other things that we've been trying over this summer is we've been using some of the woody debris that was collected, the mulch, as a protective layer over the sands to prevent wind erosion, as well as to slowly start to renovate and add some nutrients and organic matter into the soil. We've also got some other fairly novel ideas there. So one of our ideas is to demonstrate the use of a mobile biochar unit. Biochar is a kind of interesting material. I've worked with some in West Tennessee, some of the formerly flooded fields there. So biochar, a charcoal-like material that we can produce. We take the woody biomass, heat it in the absence of oxygen. We end up with this very carbon-rich material,
which is a natural residue of a disaster like this, right?
And so we have done work with this in Jackson, Tennessee, where we put biochar on, and the more biochar we put on, we increased soil, the water content of the soil, as well as it reduced infiltration rate.
Water hold capacity.
So yeah, we think this is going to be, a kind of win-win situation if we can get that to work. There's obviously some other things. This summer, we've been growing some summer annuals just to try and get something growing into those things to show what's worked. But the main objective is to be ready come the fall, to start seeding.
We'll have the drone seeds as well.
That's how we will have that. There are some fields, for example, these silt fields are very difficult to get on. We're going to have a demonstration with a company that has a capability of seeding 200 acres a day using drones.
Oh, wow.
And that would be maybe really great to place that you cannot drive a tractor yet, right? We still have some of these very silty areas that is really tough to push a tractor into this. Awesome. I think that was a great conversation. I'm very, very glad to have you here, Forbes, to talk about this Hurricane Helene recovery that we have been facing in Tennessee. Thank you for being here. Any final comments before we wrap up this?
I guess, our plan here is, surprisingly, there's very little information out there what to do from previous floods. So our plan here is to gather as much information and data as possible so that we are ready for the next flood. And we don't know where the next flood is going to be. Is it going to be in Middle Tennessee, West Tennessee, or East Tennessee? But we should be better prepared.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here with us in this livestock podcast sponsored by the University of Tennessee Beef and Forage Center. Hope everyone tunes in the next month for another insightful conversation about all things beef and forage, and hope to see you guys in the field day next week.